What is up, everybody? Thank you so much for joining us. You are listening to the Grace and the Gray podcast, where we use the black and white of Scripture to speak truth into the gray areas of culture. Sam, why don't you tell us a little bit about what we're talking about today?
We're talking about our childhoods. Everybody get ready. Buckle up.
Wow.
No. I do want you to think back to your childhood for a specific reason, though. Was there a church-run program or after-school activity that you participated in that you remember, you have a fond memory of?
Well, we did a couple of years. So my elementary years were diverse, I will say. I started first grade in public school, and then did second and a portion of third grade as a homeschooled student until I broke my mom, and she decided that she didn't want to do that anymore and got rid of me and my older brother and sent us to a private Christian school. So then I did have that level of interaction. I did that through the end of fifth grade and then went back to public school for middle school and high school and then for college as well. So
yeah, mine wasn't quite that varied. I don't think I was ever homeschooled because y'all were already done with that by the time I was schooling age. I went to kindergarten twice.
Way to go, Ben.
That's hard to say out loud.
Yeah.
I had a conversation with my parents since then to try to figure out like what made you guys / the teacher decide that I needed to redo it, because my birthday's in August and that's pretty near the cutoff for starting a year later. But they put me in early and then decided to have me do it again. And I found out years and years later that the reason for that was because, especially in a kindergarten classroom, the way that they gauge your success level or readiness for the first grade year is the way that you socialize with other kids. So I feel like the odds were stacked against me to begin with.
Ben's well on his way back to a three-peat.
I'm 31 years old, and I still, like, if I can avoid it, I just do avoid social interaction with other people. So that's why I went to kindergarten twice. And I don't help me figure out, because I don't have a really great memory of some of this stuff, but I think you may remember more than I do. I went to school in a kindergarten class with someone named Miss Waters as my teacher. Was there a school that existed that was called Lonnie B?
Yeah, that was our elementary school. It was the public elementary school we went to in Columbia. Lonnie B. Nelson Elementary School.
Okay, Lonnie B. For some reason, I have a wire cross between Lonnie B. Nelson and Junie B. Jones. And I'm almost certain I didn't go to a school called Junie B. Jones. So Lonnie B. Nelson, fair enough. So I went to kindergarten 1 year there, I guess. I don't know where the other year in kindergarten was. Maybe it was both there. But then first grade and second grade I did in the private school. That was called ACES, Aiken Christian Elementary School at the time. Does it still exist?
No, it doesn't exist anymore.
It was a Delphi or something like that. I think they changed the name after we were there. Yeah. Anyway, so I did 2 years of that and then went to public school. So that was a religiously affiliated education.
I believe a church plant meets in that building now. It's right over there by our house. Yeah, meets in our building here in Aiken. So cool.
Yeah.
Well, outside of your Christian schooling, were there any outside programs like after school activities or, I don't know, outreach, things that were run by the church? Maybe you didn't participate in it, but maybe you remember it.
Yeah, I mean, we were involved with stuff when we were kids, just being members of the church.
I don't know, Sam, and you would probably know this better just with your interaction with working for the city before you were here working for the church. I know that we played, I'm doing air quotes, church league basketball, but I don't know. Like, I'm still unclear if that was actually run by the church, if that was run by the Baptist convention, if that was run by the city, if it was like some conglomerate of all of those running those kind of things at the same time. Because I remember when I was a kid, and at least I don't think it exists this way as like it did when we were kids. It was huge. You know what I mean? It was a ton with I mean, it was a whole league, and we played churches from all over the place, and everybody had it. And so I don't know that exists anymore. It's kind of gone away, and I don't know how, but maybe that answers a little bit of your question. So
your interaction was mainly like recreation through the church.
Yeah, as a kid, for sure. I mean, I think it would be the only level of engagement I had was where we were at the Christian school, but it wasn't our Christian school, at least to my knowledge, wasn't denominationally or specifically church affiliated, like in that it didn't have a specific sponsored church. I don't know if it had many that helped contribute to make the school happen or anything like that.
I mean, we were in a building that was on a church, like, lot or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't remember what that church was.
Yeah. But I think the school had purchased it from the church because the church moved to a different property. And again, that's all speculative and doesn't really matter. But yeah.
What about you, James?
So I had two things come to mind. The first was RAs.
Oh yeah,
and GAs, right?
Yep.
I remember that.
I forgot about Awanas, dude.
Yeah, so that's a very Baptist institution. I think it was intended to be modeled after Boy Scouts and that kind of feel. Well, what stood out to me about it was moving from mission friends to RAs, or from the younger RAs to the older RAs. My dad was leading one of those groups, the one I was moving to. And the night that, it was a Wednesday night, because, Baptist, we went from where we were into what that class was doing, and it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. They had sliced oranges, and they were using oranges and toothpicks to build a little cage around, like, a pecan or something like that was somehow meant to be like a little gorilla or something. Like, they took peanut butter and they spent time making it into some type of animal that was in this cage, and I was like, that's what they do here? This is going to be awesome. So I found out years later, talking to my dad about that was the one and only time they ever did an activity like that. So that's the origin of my unrealistic expectations on church programs.
And this is the beginning of James's testimony of how he came to the Lord.
Yeah, so it's been downhill from there. But that was a moment that had a big impact on me, for better or worse. Mm-hmm. Music in church. I thought back to something that Ben said in an earlier episode when I was on a tangent about fugues, that church, whenever the church takes on something, call it a need, call it an artistic persuasion, it's really, it's housed well there, and it becomes a machine, I think, that opens opportunity. Consistently being a part of a music ministry at every church I've been connected to has been a huge part of my life. And at a young age, that started kind of what I tell people now, which is, if you want to be good at whatever instrument you play, find a way to play it in a church, because there's the 4 or 5 hymns that you're going to sing. But if you're a piano player and you're playing for old people in a Sunday school class, they want a prelude. This particular place didn't need a postlude, but they wanted a prelude, and they wanted 10 minutes of music before everything started. And it wasn't, you couldn't pull from the songs that you were learning. So you're talking, for a new kid at this, like 10 new songs a week that you had to familiarize yourself enough with to not embarrass yourself in front of 15 people that really didn't care that much. But it was a responsibility that I was able to take on in a safe environment. And that has been replicated in every place I've been with music. So I think the church, that's one of the things the church still does really well, is shepherding music.
Mm-hmm. So I'm hearing education, recreation, vocation, or musical interests.
You sound like a Southern Baptist preacher right now. How many Asians can we get in this?
Well, I missed it. What was that spelling?
Oh, yeah. An acrostic or an acronym or something. I wasn't involved with the church that I helped out with. One of my softball teammates was, but we did a one-day Salkahatchee, and we went and did somebody's roof. So that was like the church giving back to the community, and I think it was somewhere in Aiken. And then Vacation Bible School is the only other church related program I can think of outside of church. But the reason I ask is Rick brought up one day, just in conversation, how the church was actually, I guess, Rick, you can talk about it better than I can, but how they founded basically hospitals and education and so many other things that I never even realized.
Yeah, so it's been kind of an interesting thing, and I don't know what the Lord's doing in my heart, kind of pressing this, and it's just been a thought that's been recurring, has been stealing from our own podcast, where some of these areas that we try to make black and white in terms of political and cultural, especially here in the West in the United States, have intersected historically with the church and the faith and how the church has responded to those. And so I went kind of just on a weird deep dive research into some of my church history books and that kind of stuff, trying to determine what the faith's involvement has been. What started the quest was specifically into healthcare, and it was just because I had the thought in my mind, healthcare has become a radically politicized issue here in the United States with the rise of Obamacare and those types of things over the last decade, and what the involvement of people should be in healthcare and the provision of healthcare for all people. And so I went in and I said, well, how has the church historically interacted with that question or with questions like that? And it started all the way back in the Roman Empire and the New Testament church. And you find the church being one of the first places that we get any level of organized healthcare, particularly for the oppressed or marginalized in a society. So the Roman Empire was very much predicated upon power and position. Like, those are two of the marking things. And so most of, if not all of, the medical care that's on record inside of the Roman Empire, provided by the government, if you will, was really just provided for soldiers and elite leaders inside of the political. When the church began to meet in Rome and began to draw thousands of people, and if you read through the New Testament and then continue through church history, you see one of the ways that they did that, and this is going to continue all the way through things like the bubonic plague, and you can continue to unpack all the way through the pages of human and church history to see how all of these roads cross. The church has historically stood at the forefront of pushing the gospel forward through things like medicine by providing for the needy. And the reason that was an interesting thought for me, and I thought maybe worth discussion here, is because there's been a shift, at least in my perception, and I'm interested in you guys' opinion of this, because, and this, I'm speaking in broad generalities that you as a listener may fit into, you may not. But the bulk majority in the Bible Belt of what I find to be evangelical Christians would identify themselves as Republican, which is fine. We can have different discussions on that. But that is also the party that is most likely to argue against any sort of socialized welfare or socialized health care, where the most marginalized and oppressed would have easy access to free or affordable health care. And that's just there was an interesting intersection looking at the church history, the church's history, the West's history, and our calling as believers. And so I guess maybe the question that I was launching into is, what do you think our involvement should be as believers? What's the black and white of Scripture for things like healthcare and even welfare, if we want to go into that realm of discussion as well? What's our call biblically? And then should that affect how we do things like interact with the ballots, the votes that we cast, or the political party that we align ourselves with, or the way that we feel about these complex issues that play out on our culture? So,
I mean, you have New Testament references to Christ being a healer. You have manifestations of that, which I don't know if we've ever talked about this on the podcast, but I know we've at least talked about it a little bit when we went through the miracle series. Just the fact that the miracles of the New Testament are what are commonly referred to as enacted miracles, which means they're not just magic things happening to show that Christ can do magic things. They're specific and they're strategized to reveal an element of Christ's identity. And since healing is commonly shown in the Old Testament as something that can be done by Yahweh, the fact that Christ is doing it miraculously is a revelation of Christ's divinity on a literary level. And I think the interesting thing then becomes, because I know a lot of the push in early church history to formalize healthcare for people was motivated by Christ's identity as a physician. But the struggle is you have almost two branching, what would you say, directions of that philosophy, where one is the really like spiritually driven, miraculous healing through church history, and the other is healthcare, medical care, physiological focus, as a reflection of what Christ's miraculous healing did, or the revelation of God as a healer. And that to me makes things a little bit more complicated, because you have those two branches, and I just wonder, like, which one is better, which one is a more accurate depiction of who God is, which one, that I don't know how to weigh those two options, being that they both are not only predominant throughout history, but also still have manifestations today.
Yeah. I think some of what the conviction or the thought line that didn't let me escape from whatever God was doing as I was thinking about this, and I still don't know it incompletely, is I feel like, and it's part of when we first created this podcast that gave me excitement about it, and hopefully the same for you as a listener, is we try to take, and I think this is a Western post-Enlightenment characteristic, Ben, but you may be able to help her agree or disagree with that. We try to take unbelievably complex issues and fit them into neat little boxes that answer or scratch or whatever, satisfy the complexity of that to our level. And I think some of my frustration with what I see playing out by what would be mainstreamed as evangelical culture in America is this idea of how we are to respond to the poor and hurting and broken, sick and meek around us, because the black and white of Scripture for me is that we're supposed to care. And then what does it look like to politicize that, or to position ourselves in a way that we can help? I was thinking about it as you were talking, James, even about music, and then understanding the history of healthcare throughout developed civilization was, man, this in those periods of time would have been another thing like music that the church was the best at, that if you were sick, you needed one of those Christian people. If you were in need of care, you needed one. If you were poor, if you were hurting, if you were doing those kind of things. And now it feels like we've maybe this is unfair, but I'm saying it anyway. It feels like for a large portion of Christian culture in the West, we have passed the buck to the government will take care of that. The government should take care of that. Or the flip side of the coin, the government shouldn't take care of that, and they also shouldn't mandate that I take care of that, and we just don't ever interact with it at all, with this idea of providing care for people. And so it struggles and wrestles, and I don't know. That was kind of my line of thinking in that.
Well, that was going to be my question. Do you feel like the church was pushed out of caring, or that they stepped away voluntarily?
B. That's something that I walked right into as soon as I saw what we were talking about today and some of the early thoughts on it. It appears to me, if you want to talk about widows and orphans, you want to talk about health care, if you want to talk about any number of church tangent related
or
things.
mental health care.
Yeah. All of those things started like the early church did, with the gospel of there was very like one-to-one, see a need, respond to it, and something grew out of that. Necessarily it becomes more formalized, because once you start bringing thousands of people into it, it has to be organized to continue doing what it's doing in a meaningful way, in my opinion. I think healthcare works the same way. I think the church has unfortunately allowed things to kind of take that off of their hands. I think that goes back to, just like with the rest of that, it requires the people doing it to keep the main thing, because doing those things in the name of Christ is something awful to lose. And I think it's unfair on the other side too. I don't see it as a political issue. I do think it's a government issue, and I don't think I don't see it as a bureaucracy either. Take the number of people that you would have if, compared to like DSS in the state of South Carolina. How many Christians do you have that have a heart for making sure that kids are taken care of? And it's a drop in the bucket, the number of people that are kind of saddled with that authority or with that responsibility. It's a numbers thing at its most basic. Mm-hmm. It's a huge task to put in the hands of very few people that understandably will be overwhelmed by the monstrosity. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's big and it's often bad, and I don't think we're serving ourselves or the people that are looking, that whether they know it or not, need to be served by someone to love them in this way. I don't think we accomplish that by handing it or allowing it to be done by an agent.
So do you think that the church should try to reclaim?
Take back hospitals.
Or education, or and then how?
It's interesting to me too, and I don't know, I'm not ducking your question, and I certainly want to circle back to that, but there's really also an interesting development, Ben, and I don't know if you've ever looked at this, or any of you guys. There was a move away from the Christian faith being one of the central components of healthcare that actually coincided with the Reformation. Because before that, you had monastic hospitals, those kind of things where
Franciscans.
Monks and nuns were kind of the chief in those areas of providing healthcare, of developing medical remedies, of doing all of those kind of things. And then as the Reformation happened, and then that coupled with the Enlightenment, these things kind of shifted towards a more secular realm. Like the church kind of, I agree with you, James, kind of just backseated themselves and said, hey, and some of that was maybe intentional, some of it was unintentional. I wasn't alive then.
I mean, you did have Protestant
hospitals. For sure. I mean, I was born in Baptist Hospital in Columbia, South Carolina, and that's also an interesting thing. If you didn't know this history of that, a lot of hospitals in the United States are named after denominations or churches or saints or whatever you may have, because they were either funded originally or planted in partnership with church organizations or religious organizations. Yeah. It's not just
Bon Secours in Greenville is another good example. Yeah. It's Catholic.
Yeah, they didn't just randomly get named after a saint. Those were intentional decisions that are made. And I think some of the shrink back is also just the unbelievable complexity that exists in the medical field, coupled with the unbelievable complexity that exists in our society of lawsuits and medical malpractice and that kind of thing. And it's, man, who's best able to handle this? But I think some of the struggle with, when we get to those unbelievably complex questions, I think sometimes our human sin nature just says, well, just shrink out. Like, exit stage left quietly. And I think these are unbelievably pressing issues for our culture that also present for us, just like they have historically, opportunities to share and demonstrate the gospel with our culture. And if we just continually shrink back and step away from it, and I don't know, it's easy to say, and I'm willing to admit I don't know what that involvement looks like or how we step up to that plate, but I know that there's something to be done. I think of how many missionary organizations in the third world are rooted in healthcare and childcare, right? Like those two areas, and those opportunities exist here in the States. And I don't know. I think a lot of times we don't engage that because my fear is because it's politicized or it's complex, and we just simply don't want to wade into it.
Do you remember for a while? Mom was helping with like a free health clinic here in Aiken.
The free medical clinic of Aiken County?
Is that still here? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I think being able to set up something like that where you're really just your primary function is like taking care of routine things in a manner that is effective and efficient and priced appropriately for people who would struggle with seeking medical care for things like that. That's a fantastic example of something that is actually actionable and practical for the church in the modern era. Because there are people that attend churches that are able to do things like that. And Mom serving with that clinic our mom is a registered nurse, for additional context. That's a good example as far as like the church actually stepping up to the plate in terms of like having hospitals again. I don't know if that would even be remotely possible, given the fact that at this point, like, for better or for worse, for-profit hospitals are a thing, and that's the biggest portion of the market, right, is for-profit hospitals. And if there's a lot of people making a lot of money doing that, for the church to start trying to recreate this idea of like not created for profit, but created for community service type hospitals, that's what they would be in direct competition with. And things like medical equipment, medical staff salaries are going to be set by the standard that has already been created now at for-profit hospitals. And those for-profit hospitals make a lot of money.
For a lot of people.
So the expenses are high because of that. So yeah, I don't know that it would be practical for something like that, but like helping to staff with volunteers, free health clinic in a community, like absolutely doable.
I think there's also some ways, like I think about, and shout out to one of our small group, home group leaders here, Flo, who's my girl. I think there's also inside of the structure as it exists, is there's opportunities for people to get involved, be it a free healthcare or the big for-profit hospitals that you see, answering the phone, doing visitations, spending time with people who are in there sick and in need of care. And I certainly, my thought or my conviction has certainly not been the church needs to relaunch the hospitals. I think that's an unbelievably dramatic calling that I don't think is practical.
So I guess the conversation is, since that's not practical, but that's what we have existed as historically, how do we make the transition into modernity in a way that still supports that kind of care?
And I think the invitation that I want to issue to the listener is like, how does a better, more accurate understanding of healthcare in the church invite you into a wrestling match as you think about the way that you feel about the complexities of socialized healthcare, of these issues that we have a tendency to just draw hard party lines on and then remove ourselves from actually having to think about it? Because it's not, and this isn't, I'm going to try to politically correct this the best that I can. Like, the Republican Party has been so anti Obamacare, right, wrong, or indifferent, but there are aspects of Obamacare, and this is where the complexity of the issue lies. There are aspects of Obamacare that I could very easily tie to the gospel mandate to love people, right? To be able to provide healthcare, to be able to use some of our resources to do it. And we won't get into the complexities right now of, well, should I be forced to do that or should I not be forced to do that? That's where some of that encouragement. But I think there's so much value, and we skirt around this as believers in not wrestling with some of these gray areas of culture, because I think it's going to cause us to do what we're like, okay, I know that I need to do something. I'm not going to build a hospital. I'm not going to break ground on a hospital, but I am going to examine, what does it look like for me to love the sick and needy around me in the way that the gospel would compel me to, beyond going, well, I don't like Obamacare, or we should all have Obamacare. That's an easy cop-out.
Okay. So tell me, just to make sure I understand, tell me if this is an accurate reflection of what you're saying. Yeah. The issue is not like holding one view or another concerning something like universalized healthcare. The issue is believing that holding that position is a fulfillment of your spiritual obligation to care about the needs of others. Yeah,
and even in more than that, I think it's that, and then also it's the same thing that we see ourselves positioning as and battling for in American culture that's so heartbreaking, and I think removes the ability to advance the gospel and the ability to just progress as humanity, which is my position on things like socialized healthcare render me morally superior to you, dependent upon which position I take on that. And I'm like, that's such a dense way to start an argument, in my opinion. Like, there's nothing when you arrive at that position, there is nothing for you to gain, nor for the person that you're having a conversation to gain from being in relationship with you. And that, to me, runs directly counter to the gospel.
So what's a practical way the believer can see needs and meet needs?
I mean, I think we've highlighted a few of them. Some of them are obvious. There's medical clinics and probably somewhere.
For the the registered nurse.
Yeah, but there's involvement in.
Yeah, we volunteered at those clinics as well.
I mean,
really?
You can do paperwork. There's a variety of different ways.
Yeah. There's a lot of people don't know this about me, but I'm not a registered nurse.
Or a doctor. Well, he's about to go third round of kindergarten, so we're.
Oh yeah.
Oh, that's full circle. There's tons of ways to be involved in organizations like that, and I think some of it, and this sounds heady or whatever, but I don't mean it that way. Some of it is just like give yourself permission as a believer to do what we do on this podcast, and that is wrestle with complex issues, recognizing that they're complex, and that your opinion may continually change on them based on your understanding of Scripture, based on what the Holy Spirit's doing in your life, based on all of those things, the relationships that you have with people, and be willing to engage for your betterment and the betterment of society, and with the hope of sharing the gospel in these complex issues. And I think that was my mindset in wanting to have this conversation, is to take this complex issue and maybe even give a bit more complexity to it as we see it spilled out on the pages of the history of our faith. So, yeah,
the sum total of like all the activity that goes into any one of these different directions you could go with this conversation become mind-boggling for me anyway. My thought to the person listening that is interested in anything we've talked about is to, for one, we talk about SHAPE a lot, and I butcher this acronym every time I try to do it, but it's...
Just say it's going to be in the show notes.
Yeah, it'll be in the show notes. But the bottom line is God has cut you out for a specific type of thing that you're uniquely equipped to do at a time in your life. You may get better at that. You may have that change every once in a while. But at the very least, the thing you see going on around you that you go, and you want to know a little bit more about it, or the thing that bothers you when you see it happening, God gave you those instincts for a reason. Follow that out and see what you find on the other side, because in my opinion, that's where a whole lot of the origins of the things we've talked about today started, with somebody going, it bothers me that this. And in the process of chasing the answer to that question, we're here today where we're like, well, the hospitals, we're talking about the politicization of something that is in our country like ubiquitous. It's understood that regardless of how you're going to address it, if I break my leg on the way out of here, y'all can run me here to Aiken Regional, or for another 30 minutes you can run me to any other highly reputed hospitals in the area. And all that came from somebody that centuries ago said, I think we should be doing this.
Yeah, we can organize this process en masse.
Well, good discussion. Thanks for listening to the Grace and the Gray podcast. We'll be back again in 2 weeks.